After World War II, the American conservative movement was disjointed. With fascism defeated, the nation prepared to face a new enemy, communism. Three movements emerged in the debate about a political platform for a new type of Republican Party. The first faction is called the Old Right, or Paleo-Conservatism. The Old Right advocates for anti-interventionism, economic protectionism, and an emphasis on what they call Anglo-Christian culture. Books like Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, written in 1948, and The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, written in 1953, provided the philosophical foundations for paleo-conservative ideology. Russell Kirk traced the origins of conservatism to an 18th century British politician named Edmund Burke. Burke defended the Constitution and the British monarchy. He was horrified at the French Revolution and worked to prevent a similar situation from unfolding in England. Burke felt reforms should be undertaken cautiously, since reforms have both the potential to improve or worsen societal conditions. Based on his Christian faith, he believed that politicians were not merely representatives of the society in which they lived, but were meant to represent past and future generations. He held that God's divine plan and will could be known through the prejudices and traditions which millennia of human experience with divine means and judgments have implanted in the mind of the species. Due to his moral beliefs, he rejected the Enlightenment and argued that tradition was a better guide for ordering society than reason.
Society requires not only that the passions of individuals should be subjected, but that even in the mass and body, as well as in the individuals, the inclinations of men should frequently be thwarted, their will controlled, and their passions brought into subjection. This can only be done by a power out of themselves, and not, in the exercise of its function, subject to that will and to those passions which it is its office to bridle and subdue.
The other faction is libertarianism. Thinkers like Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard declared that societal services should be provided by the private market. In her books like The Fountainhead, written in 1943, and Atlas Shrugged, written in 1957, Ayn Rand introduced a theory called objectivism.
On the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality, which has so far been believed impossible, namely, a morality not based on faith, not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
Murray Rothbard believed in laissez-faire capitalism, but also believed that a true commitment to that system required him to support what he called anarcho-capitalism. In an anarcho-capitalist society, all functions, including law enforcement, education, and military defense, would be performed by private entities. Rothbard envisioned a contract-based society where all interactions would be regulated based on predetermined principles of self-ownership, defined as the right to control one's own body, and the principle of non-aggression, defined as the prohibition against violence or coercion of others. Libertarians and paleo-conservatives disagreed most about religion and morality. Ayn Rand often rejected the conservative label since she believed conservative arguments were made from faith and tradition and were irrational. Rand also felt there was a rising anti-intellectual sentiment within conservatism throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Russell Kirk had criticisms of libertarianism as well. While he applauded the libertarian opposition to the monolithic state and the libertarian opposition to interventionist foreign policy, he believed that libertarian ideas were inadequate because they would destroy the ability of the state to perform its most basic functions. In Kirk's view, a true conservative believes in the necessity of the state to protect the nation militarily and to adjudicate justice. A true conservative, he argues, simply takes issue with an attempt to make the government the manager of a citizen's entire life. Kirk contended that the dividing line in politics wasn't between totalitarianism and liberalism, but between those who believed in a transcendent moral order and those who did not. Kirk believed that by rejecting the concept of a transcendent moral order, libertarians were actually converts to Karl Marx's dialectic materialism.
The libertarian groups differ on some points among themselves and exhibit varying degrees of fervor. but one may say of them in general that they are philosophical anarchists in bourgeois dress. Of society's old institutions, they would retain only private property. They seek an abstract liberty that never has existed in any civilization nor, for that matter, among any barbarous people or any savage. They would sweep away political government. In this, they subscribe to Karl Marx's notion of the withering away of the state.
On October 1st, 1949, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong rose to power. In February of 1950, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces supported by the Soviet Union crossed the 38th parallel into United States-occupied South Korea. Both Democratic President Harry Truman and Republican President Dwight Eisenhower intervened to prevent South Korea's collapse. The Korean War came to a close when an armistice with China and North Korea was reached on July 27, 1953. By offering military aid and troops, the U.S. and its allies had successfully fought the expansion of communism. In 1955, a man named William F. Buckley Jr. created a publication called National Review, which would popularize this new approach to anti-communist foreign policy. James Burnham, a disenchanted former communist turned conservative, wrote a book called Containment or Liberation. In the book, he argues that the United States should assume its place as a leader on the global stage. A containment strategy assumed that the United States could coexist with communist nations as long as those nations modified their political goals. However, Burnham thought that containment gave communist nations an offensive strategic advantage while allowing them to decide when and where a conflict would occur. Burnham insisted that the United States and the Soviet Union were already at war, not a traditional war, but a war of politics and ideas. In response, he argued for a policy of liberation, where the destruction of Soviet-based communism would be the central objective of U.S. foreign policy. This policy would include fomenting the collapse of communist regimes and waging anti-communist propaganda campaigns. Burnham and other former leftists would become editors of National Review. Russell Kirk was also convinced to work at the National Review, despite deep differences between his views and Buckley's. William F. Buckley, James Burnham, and others at National Review advocated for interventionist anti-communism. Buckley supported non-interventionist communism until around 1954. By 1955, he reasoned that interventionism was necessary to maintain an independent and free United States. Instead of being fearful of a centralized, militarized American government, conservatives like Buckley thought such a government might be the only protection against a communist takeover. The interventionists positioned themselves as the politicians who were going to confront communism directly, preempting its takeover of the world. They contrasted their position against liberal appeasement, a policy which attempted to coexist with communist nations, and against the previous conservative policy of containment, which sought only to limit communism's spread. William F. Buckley was an advisor, friend, and ardent supporter of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who won the 1964 Republican presidential primary. In 1960, Senator Goldwater published the book, The Conscience of a Conservative. In his book, he argued that the U.S. foreign policy posture towards communism must be primarily offensive in nature. In addition to guarding our frontiers, we must try to puncture his. In addition to keeping the free world free, we must try to make the communist world free. This stance marked a clear rejection of the isolationist, non-interventionist policies of paleoconservatives and libertarians. Non-interventionist thinkers like Russell Kirk became less prominent. Kirk continued to publish in National Review, but his views, which insisted upon spiritual authority and limited military involvement abroad, were eclipsed. Over time, the non-interventionist position would become associated with anti-intellectualism and conspiracy theories. Senator Goldwater lost the 1964 general election to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson won 486 electoral votes. Goldwater won 52. Despite his loss, Goldwater set the foundation for a new fusionist form of conservatism, Neo-Conservatism.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
This third faction, Neo-Conservatism, was a fusion of ideas from the other conservative ideological movements. It incorporated the religious traditionalist ideas from Paleoconservatism and its belief in a transcendent moral order. It included the laissez-faire economic philosophy of libertarianism and its belief against big government. It embraced the interventionism promulgated by James Burnham and William F. Buckley, which saw the U.S. military as a necessary positive force against communism. These three elements, though sometimes referred to by different names individually, are collectively called the three-legged stool of neoconservatism. Ronald Reagan soared to victory in the 1980 and 1984 presidential elections based on this platform. Neoconservatism seemed to appease grassroots activists, Wall Street business interests, and foreign policy warhawks. However, the underlying divisions amongst the conservative factions remained. These differences would always be most pronounced during times of war.